90 seconds is the number that every sailor in a carrier strike group carries somewhere in the back of their professional consciousness. Not as a statistic, as a physical fact, a duration that the human body understands in the same way. It understands the distance between a moving car and the edge of a road. 90 seconds is the terminal flight time of a medium-range ballistic missile from radar acquisition to hull impact. At the engagement ranges that define the threat envelope of the northern Arabian Sea, 90 seconds is long enough to make decisions if the decisions have already been made. It is not long enough to make them for the first time. At 11:54 p.m., the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was operating approximately 340 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz, maintaining a position that kept the carrier's air wing within strike range of designated target sets in western Iran, while remaining outside the published engagement envelope of Iran's surviving coastal defense systems. The group had been on station for 8 days, flying sustained strike operations since March 1st, losing 3 aircraft to ground fire and surface-to-air missile engagements over Iranian territory, recovering every aircrew. The flight deck had not been cold for more than 3 hours at any point in the preceding 8 days. The air wing was tired in the way that only sustained combat operations produce, a tiredness that goes below muscle and bone into something closer to the foundation of a person's capacity to continue performing at the level the mission requires. The strike group's disposition at 11:54 p.m. placed the carrier at the center of a protective geometry that had been calculated against the specific threat environment of this operational area. 2 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers held forward positions to the north and northeast. The threat axes that the intelligence assessment identified as highest priority, given the remaining Iranian ballistic missile launch infrastructure in the Zagros and Alborz highlands. A Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser operated on the carrier's port quarter, its AN/SPY-1A radar providing coverage of the western and southwestern sectors. A third destroyer covered the southern approach. 4 ships, 1 carrier, 1 submarine operating submerged in an undisclosed position within the group's inner defensive zone, 64 aircraft on the carrier's flight deck and in the hangar bay, 31 of them armed and in various states of launch readiness for the next cycle of strike operations, scheduled to begin at 2:30 a.m. At 11:54 p.m., the lead destroyer's SPY-1D array resolved the first ballistic track, then 6 more. Then, in the space of 8 seconds, 11 additional tracks, all bearing from the northwest on trajectories consistent with launch points in the Zagros Highland missile infrastructure. Trajectories that the Aegis Engagement Management System processed and classified before the watch team could form the words. To describe what they were seeing, 18 ballistic missile tracks in terminal phase, covering a spread pattern that the system's threat assessment algorithm evaluated and flagged, with a classification that had never been generated in a real-world engagement. Strike group saturation attack. Simultaneous multi-axis. All units, weapons-free. Not one ship, all of them. All at once. The engagement coordination signal went out at 11:54:41 p.m. on the strike group's tactical net. A data burst that transmitted the threat picture, the engagement assignments, and the weapons-free authorization to every ship in the formation, simultaneously. The cruiser, the destroyers, the carrier's own defensive systems, all of it activated in the same second. A distributed defensive architecture suddenly operating as a single integrated organism, rather than 4 independent ships. Each unit drawing on the shared radar picture and allocating interceptors against a threat picture that was being updated in real time by every sensor in the formation. The Ticonderoga cruiser, whose long-range search radar provided the best coverage of the western threat axis, resolved 6 ballistic tracks that the northern destroyer's geometry had partially obscured. 6 additional contacts, bringing the total inbound track count to 24. 24 ballistic missiles in terminal phase, distributed across 3 threat axes, bearing on a formation centered on a vessel that carried 5,000 sailors, and the air wing that had been prosecuting strikes on Iranian territory for 8 days. The first SM-3 interceptors launched at 11:54:58 p.m., The SM-3 is not designed for the inner defensive fight. It is designed for this: the exo-atmospheric engagement, the intercept of a ballistic warhead in the mid-course or late terminal phase at altitudes and closing speeds that place the engagement geometry outside the atmosphere entirely. The missile's rocket motor ignition produced a thrust signature visible from the carrier's flight deck as a streak of light rising vertically into the night sky, accelerating through the low cloud layer and disappearing into the darkness above it, heading for an intercept point that existed at an altitude where the atmosphere ends and space begins. The sailors on the flight deck who saw it, the flight deck crew, standing down from the last recovery cycle, the ordnance personnel moving munitions from the elevator to the staging areas, stopped what they were doing and looked up. Not because they needed to, because the streak of light going up into the darkness was information that the body processes before the mind does. And the information was, something very serious is happening right now. In the combat information centers of all 4 surface combatants, the engagement was unfolding on a scale that had no precedent in the operational history of any system or any crew present. The strike group's total available SM-3 and SM-6 interceptor inventory was being allocated against 24 tracks in a fire control problem of a complexity that the Aegis engineers had modeled in worst-case scenario analysis, but had never expected to see executed in a real engagement. The mathematics were being done by machines because human minds could not do them at the required speed. The humans were supervising, monitoring, ready to override, and trusting, in a way that required a kind of faith in engineering that most of the people present had never been asked to produce under actual fire. That the system's logic was correct. The first ballistic intercept registered at 11:55:34 p.m. A clean kill, exo-atmospheric, debris scatter at altitude, no threat to the formation. A second, 17 seconds later. A third. The track count on the tactical display began to reduce. Slowly. Not fast enough. But moving in the right direction. Then the drone wave appeared. Not on the radar. The radar was saturated with the ballistic engagement, its processing capacity allocated to the highest speed, highest priority threats. The drone contacts resolved on the electronic warfare suite first. A mass of low-power radar emissions and data link signals bearing from the south and southeast, a direction that placed them behind the formation's primary defensive orientation, in the sector that the southern destroyer was covering, but that the strike group's overall defensive posture had weighted as secondary. The electronic warfare assessment came through at 11:56:01 p.m. 41 contacts, consistent with one-way attack drone airframes, bearing from 155 through 210 degrees, altitude approximately 300 feet, approach speed consistent with jet-powered loitering munitions. The Iranian attack planners had done the calculation that every saturation doctrine is built around. Ballistic missiles from the north to force the formation's defensive attention and interceptor allocation upward and forward. Drones from the south in the window created by that attention. To close on the carrier from the least defended bearing sector. The carrier itself was not unarmed. The ship's CIWS mounts, 3 Phalanx systems positioned to provide overlapping coverage of the ship's defensive envelope, were active and tracking. The carrier's electronic warfare suite was jamming across the drone wave's identified control frequencies. And the southern destroyer had already begun its ESSM engagement against the leading drone contacts, its VLS cells firing in a rapid sequence that sent white smoke columns rising from the destroyer's hull into the night sky, at a rate that made the ship appear, on the carrier's external cameras, to be on fire. But 41 drones against a carrier's defensive systems, while the carrier's primary escort ships were committed to a ballistic missile intercept battle on the opposite bearing sector, was the arithmetic the attack had been designed to produce. At 11:56:30 p.m., the Southern Destroyer's Tactical Action Officer made a request that had never been made in a real-world carrier strike group engagement. He requested that the cruiser split its radar coverage to provide fire control support for the drone engagement in the southern sector, while maintaining ballistic track correlation for the remaining 18 inbound ballistic missiles that had not yet been intercepted. The cruiser's Tactical Action Officer acknowledged and executed the split coverage in 4.1 seconds. The SPY-1A array was redistributed across its coverage sectors in a configuration that reduced its ballistic discrimination sensitivity by approximately 12% in exchange for the additional fire control channels needed to support the southern drone engagement. 12% was a number that existed as an abstraction on a system parameter display, in the context of an active ballistic missile engagement. 12% was the difference between a clean intercept solution and an intercept geometry that required the system to make assumptions that the engineers had designed it to make conservatively. The cruiser accepted the trade-off and began supporting the southern engagement. The drone wave reduction began. ESSM rounds from the southern destroyer engaging the leading contacts, the carrier's own CIWS beginning to work the contacts that survived to within its effective range. The Phalanx systems on the carrier were firing at their maximum operational cadence, the distinctive mechanical shriek of each engagement audible on the flight deck over the background noise of the carrier's propulsion plant, a sound that brought the flight deck crew to positions behind blast deflectors, and raised hands, and crouched postures that training had made automatic. In the carrier's Combat Direction Center, the admiral commanding the strike group was watching the tactical picture with a stillness that the staff officers around him would later describe in their debriefs as the most professionally demanding thing they had ever witnessed. The formation was engaged simultaneously in a ballistic missile intercept battle and a drone swarm engagement on opposite bearing sectors, with every system operating at or beyond its designed sustained load. The admiral was tracking the interceptor inventory across all 4 ships in real time. He was watching the counts decrease. He was calculating the reserve margin that would remain at the end of the engagement, if the engagement ended, and comparing that margin against the intelligence estimate for a follow-on attack capability. The numbers were uncomfortable. At 11:57 p.m., 6 ballistic tracks remained. 3 had executed maneuvering re-entry profiles that had forced the engagement system to allocate additional SM-3 rounds beyond the standard single-shot allocation. The lead northern destroyer had expended 61% of its SM-3 inventory. The cruiser had expended 44%. The second destroyer, which had been covering the northeastern threat axis, had expended 78%. The drone count had been reduced from 41 to 17 by the combined efforts of the southern destroyer's ESSM engagement and the carrier's Phalanx systems. 17 drones remained inbound, inside 4 nautical miles of the carrier, and the southern destroyer's ESSM inventory was at 31% of pre-engagement load. One of the 6 remaining ballistic tracks presented a classification that the engagement system flagged at 11:57:14 p.m., with a priority marker that caused the lead destroyer's tactical action officer to physically lean forward in his seat. The track's terminal profile was consistent with a variant that Iranian military analysts had assessed as a theoretical capability, but that no confirmed deployment had been documented. A ballistic warhead with a submunition dispensing mechanism designed to separate at terminal altitude and produce multiple independent impact points from a single missile body. If the classification was correct, a single SM-3 intercept against this track might eliminate the carrier body, but leave the submunitions to continue independently. The tactical action officer allocated 2 SM-3 rounds against the flagged track. The first intercept achieved a direct hit at 11:57:41 p.m. The debris analysis confirmed the warhead had been a single-body conventional variant. The classification had been based on a profile ambiguity that the system had resolved conservatively. The second round was unnecessary, but had already been committed. 2 SM-3 rounds spent on a target that required 1, in a magazine that was approaching its reserve threshold. At 11:58 p.m., the carrier's 3 Phalanx systems were working at sustained maximum engagement cadence against the final 14 drone contacts that had penetrated to within 2 nautical miles. The flight deck was empty of personnel. The 4.5 acres of flight deck that represented the most valuable piece of naval real estate in the region at this moment was vacant, except for the aircraft chalked and chained to its surface and the automated weapon systems firing from their deck-mounted positions. 3 drones were eliminated at ranges between 1,800 and 1,200 yards by the forward and starboard Phalanx mounts, working in coordinated overlapping coverage. 2 drones were taken by the port Phalanx at 890 and 740 yards. The 6th drone of the remaining group was running a sea-skimming approach profile that kept it below the optimal engagement elevation of the port Phalanx mount. The system tracked it, the barrel depressed to its mechanical limit. The engagement geometry was marginal, achievable, within the system's parameters, but requiring a solution that placed the round's trajectory at an angle that increased the risk of incomplete intercept. The port Phalanx fired. The drone was struck at 310 yards. Not a clean kill. The 20mm rounds impacted the airframe's fuselage rather than the warhead section, producing structural damage that caused the airframe to pitch nose down and impact the water at high speed approximately 180 yards from the carrier's port hull. The water impact was close enough that the column of spray from the detonation, the drone's shaped charge warhead triggering on the water surface rather than the hull, was visible from the carrier's bridge as a white eruption that rose to approximately 40 feet before collapsing. Close enough that the pressure wave from the detonation registered on the carrier's hull as a perceptible tremor. The carrier's damage control teams were already in position. Watertight integrity check. No hull breach. The detonation had occurred on the water surface rather than against the hull. The shaped charge had dissipated its energy upward and outward rather than into the ship's steel. 180 yards. The final 8 drone contacts were engaged and eliminated by the Southern destroyer's remaining ESSM rounds and the carrier's aft Phalanx system between 11:58:30 p.m. and 11:59:14 p.m. The last contact was neutralized at 11:59:14 p.m., exactly 64 seconds after the port Phalanx's 310-yard engagement. And the Combat Direction Center confirmed 0 inbound contacts on all sensors at 11:59:21 p.m., 5 minutes and 27 seconds from first ballistic track resolution to last drone elimination. The Admiral stood at the tactical display for 11 seconds without speaking. His staff did not speak either. The display showed a clean picture. Empty sky across all threat sectors, settled contacts from the debris patterns of the intercepts, the formation holding its disposition in the dark Arabian Sea. He said 2 things. He said, "Strike group status." And then, after receiving the report from each ship in turn, he said, "Continue the mission." The accounting that followed over the next 40 minutes was the accounting of a victory that had cost more than any planner had modeled as acceptable expenditure for a single engagement. The strike group's combined SM-3 inventory had been reduced to 19% of its pre-engagement load across all 4 surface combatants. The lead destroyer was carrying 6 SM-3 rounds. The cruiser was carrying 11. The second destroyer was carrying 4, against an adversary that had demonstrated the capability and the intent to execute a 24-missile, 41-drone simultaneous saturation attack. Those numbers did not represent a defensive posture. They represented a gap. The resupply timeline was 36 hours. The fleet logistics ship that carried the interceptor inventory was 36 hours away at best speed. 36 hours during which the strike group would continue operating, continuing its strike mission against Iran, with a fraction of the defensive capacity it had possessed at 11:54 p.m. The carrier's air wing launched its next strike cycle at 2:31 a.m., 1 minute late, attributable to a pre-launch ordnance inspection that the ordnance officer had extended by 60 seconds after the evening's engagement, on the grounds that he wanted to verify that every round on the flight deck was exactly what the manifest said it was. 32 aircraft. Their exhaust trails in the pre-dawn sky formed a pattern visible on the carrier's wake cameras as a grid of departure, tracks heading northwest toward Iranian territory. Below those tracks, the carrier moved through water that was the same temperature it had been at 11:54 p.m., carrying the same 5,000 sailors, with fewer defensive rounds in the magazines and more knowledge in the Combat Direction Center about what the adversary was willing to do and how precisely they had planned it. A strike group at sea is not a fortress. It is a moving argument, a continuous assertion, made in fuel and steel and interceptor inventory, and the sustained attention of the people who operate it, that this water is accessible to the forces that depend on it. The assertion does not become less expensive to make because it has been made before. It becomes more expensive. Every engagement draws down the margin. Every resupply cycle is a race between depletion and replenishment that the adversary is trying to win by forcing engagements faster than the logistics chain can answer them. 5 minutes and 27 seconds. 24 ballistic missiles. 41 drones. A detonation at 180 yards from a hull carrying 5,000 people. The arithmetic of that night in the Arabian Sea does not simplify into a clean summary of success. It simplifies into a number, 19%. That is what remained in the magazines after the formation defended itself. 19% of the interceptor inventory that represents the difference between a carrier strike group that can continue its mission and one that cannot. The mission continued on 19% in the dark, with the logistics ship still 36 hours away. What keeps 5,000 people alive at sea is not a number in a magazine. It is the refusal to allow the number to become the only thing that matters.